The widow arrives. Richmond has a way of keeping its secrets until they start to rot. The summer air was heavy the day they found the first box. The workers were pulling down the old tobacco warehouse beam by beam, coughing on centuries of dust when a hollow sound rang out beneath the floorboards. It wasn't the echo of wood on wood. It was the unmistakable, heart-freezing clatter of wood on something else. They pried up the boards and found a small coffin-sized crate, perfectly square, perfectly clean despite decades hidden in the dark. Inside, a single gold wedding band glinting even in the dim light and a small glass vial stoppered with wax. A sweet, bitter smell leaked into the room. By nightfall, they would find 7 more. And Richmond would remember the name Ruth Holloway, the world of 1782. The Virginia of 1782 was raw and restless, still bleeding from revolution. Great plantations rose like white pillars along the James River, their owners swaggering in the glow of victory. The war had broken some fortunes and minted others, leaving the old social order cracked and shifting like thawing ice. It was into this fractured world that Ruth Holloway stepped, a lone widow with pale gray eyes that seemed to watch everything and miss nothing. She told a story that melted even the coldest Richmond hearts. Her husband, Captain Jonathan Holloway, had died heroically at Yorktown, leaving her with nothing but his name and a leather-bound journal of family remedies. People whispered about her beauty, auburn hair that caught the last of the afternoon sun, a laugh like a silver bell, but they whispered more about her intellect. She could quote Locke and Cicero over supper, debate politics with the planters, and mix an herbal draft that could calm a fever in hours. Doctors were scarce and costly. Ruth was both healer and companion to Richmond's rising elite. The first courtship Colonel Edmund Fairfax was the first to fall under her spell. He was wealthy, a tobacco baron with more land than he could ride across in a day. And he was captivated by this widow who spoke like a philosopher and brewed tea like a magician. Within months, they were married. The house on Clay Street filled with music and guests, and Ruth seemed the picture of happiness. But the slaves noticed things the white families did not. They saw the way Ruth measured powders at night by candlelight, how she kept her medicine chest locked, how she would walk into the woods alone and return with her basket brimming with herbs she never allowed the cook to touch. One humid August night, Colonel Fairfax's moans woke the household. When the servant Jupiter peered through the window, he saw his master bent double over his desk, sweat soaking through his nightshirt, while Ruth held a steaming cup to his lips. "Drink," she said gently, as if coaxing a child. "I prepared it with special care." Minutes later, Fairfax convulsed once, twice, queried and collapsed forward onto the desk. The perfect widow by dawn, Ruth was the very image of grief. Her sobs shook the house, her hand stained with ink from clutching her husband's body as if she could will him back to life. Dr. Harrison declared the death a case of acute gastric fever, a common enough fate in Virginia's humid summers. Society wept with her. Men offered financial help. Women brought baskets of food. And within weeks, Ruth was seated again at the tables of Richmond's finest, pale and tragic, wearing black silk and drawing every gaze in the room. But grief is supposed to soften over time, not sharpen. 3 months after the funeral, Ruth was seen smiling again at Captain William Randolph, a man who had made his fortune supplying the Continental Army during the war. Whispers began to stir. And then, another death. Another sudden illness. Another vial of bitter-smelling powder found hidden behind a wallboard. 2 dead husbands in less than 2 years. By the time the slaves began passing quiet warnings to one another, it was already too late. Ruth Holloway was just getting started. The Webb Titan's reign came to Richmond the night Captain William Randolph died, a thin, silvery drizzle that turned the gaslit streets into rivers of trembling light. The city slept soundly, unaware that its most charming widow had just made herself even richer. Randolph's final hours were quiet, almost eerily so. While the household fretted outside his locked study, Ruth stayed at his side, dabbing his brow, coaxing spoonfuls of her digestive elixir between his chapped lips. His strong sailor's hands, hands that had once wrestled sails in Atlantic gales, trembled like autumn leaves. By dawn they were still. Dr. Harrison noted bilious fever. The mourners noted Ruth's trembling sobs, her frail collapse at the funeral. the way she pressed Randolph's signet ring to her lips as though she meant to disappear into grief. The slaves, however, noted something else entirely. The whisper network Caesar, the old houseman, found the vial. It had rolled behind a loose wallboard in Randolph's study, thin glass clouded with a white dust that smelled faintly of bitter almonds. He said nothing to the white mourners. He told only Jupiter, who now worked in another household. Jupiter's eyes went wide. "I seen one just like it when Colonel Fairfax died," he whispered. "Cook made me throw it in the river. Said it weren't meant for our eyes." And so the whispers began to move through Richmond's hidden network, from scullery maid to stable boy, from field hand to laundress. They began to watch her. How she walked alone in the woods and returned with baskets of wild herbs. How she kept her medicine chest locked tight. How she insisted on brewing every tincture with her own hands. They called her Mistress Holloway, but in the soft spaces between words they called her something older, something darker. A reputation forged in tragedy. Ruth, meanwhile, was blossoming. Each tragedy seemed to polish her like a jewel. By the spring of 1785, her mourning clothes were edged with fashionable lace. She hosted salons where Richmond's elite argued about the future of the young republic over sherry, while Ruth listened, smiling faintly, like a woman who knew which of them would still be alive next winter. She attracted new suitors like moths to lamplight, and they told themselves she was simply unlucky, not dangerous. Judge Thomas Henley, her third husband, was the boldest moth of them all. A man of law, wit, and ambition, he declared that Ruth had restored his belief in happiness. Their wedding was the grandest Richmond had seen in years. Fireworks boomed over the James River. People swore the widow's smile could have lit the whole city without them. But it didn't last. The dinner party. 7 months later, during a glittering dinner party, Judge Henley clutched his stomach and folded to the floor like a marionette with cut strings. Dozens of witnesses saw him choke, writhe, and go still. Ruth screamed, a piercing, perfect note, and fell to her knees beside him. When Dr. Harrison arrived, flustered and pale, Ruth was shaking too violently to speak. Acute gastric distress, the doctor decided. Shock of excitement, he muttered to his colleagues. Too rich a meal? But even as the mourners gathered at her house, as candles flickered beside Henley's coffin, Ruth was already receiving discreet offers from Richmond's wealthiest men. She demurred, eyes downcast, voice trembling with sorrow. In truth, she was already choosing the next one. Shadows behind the lace. Behind the lace curtains of her Clay Street home, Ruth worked tirelessly. She tested powders by candlelight, wrote secret symbols in the margins of her leather-bound journal, and refined her poisons to mimic common fevers and digestive ailments. The city saw a grieving woman clutching at life. The slaves saw something closer to a surgeon sharpening her instruments. George Carrington, a plantation owner with more ambition than sense, became husband number 4. He lasted 6 months. Samuel Bradford, a shipping merchant, became number 5. He survived 5. Edward Custis, banker and bon vivant, died of gastric apoplexy after only 3. Each death was swifter, cleaner, more elegant than the last. Each funeral saw Ruth's grief grow more theatrical, and each new wedding drew more nervous glances. More whispers passed like contraband between Richmond's servants. By the winter of 1789, one man had begun to notice what the others had missed. Not a servant, not a suitor, a disgraced physician named Dr. Marcus Wainwright, the only man who knew the taste of the poisons Ruth used. Because he had been the one to teach her how to make them, and he had just arrived in Richmond. The poisoner's pack doctor, Marcus Wainwright, smelled of juniper, old ink, and failure. He arrived in Richmond on a sleet-stung evening in January 1790. Slipping through the back door of the Clay Street apothecary with a trunk of glass vials and a smile that made candles gutter. Once, he had been a rising star of Philadelphia medicine, until the rumors of his experiments began. Patients who didn't stay dead. Botanical remedies that left no trace in the body. A locked laboratory behind his home that stank of charred roots and something disturbingly sweet. They had stripped him of his license, but not his curiosity. And when Ruth Holloway opened the door of her townhouse to him, her expression was not shock or fear. It was recognition, an old acquaintance. Their voices were low that first night, muffled by the hiss of the fire. "You've refined my technique," Wainwright said, holding one of her vials up to the light. Slowed the onset. Clever. The body purges the evidence before death. Even the liver keeps its silence. Ruth's smile was faint and terrible. Your work was crude, she said. Effective but loud. Mine is art. For the first time in years, Wainwright laughed. They were mirror images across the hearth. His eyes fever bright, hers cool as tarnished silver. And by the time the fire sank to embers, they had made their pact. He would supply her with exotic toxins too rare to arouse suspicion. She would pay him a share of each inheritance, and no one else in Richmond would ever know. The deadly apprenticeship Ruth began visiting his hidden laboratory on the outskirts of town, always cloaked, always after dark. Inside the crumbling brick cottage, glass flasks bubbled over blue flames. Dried herbs dangled from rafters like mummified bats. She watched as Wainwright distilled oleander into a clear syrup, belladonna into a powder so fine it drifted like smoke. He watched as she mixed them into teas, tonics, and cough syrups that smelled of roses but promised nothing but death. Emotion, she told him one night, is the only thing that clouds precision. That is why women make better killers. We are taught from birth to perform grief while thinking of dinner menus. Wainwright almost admired her. Almost. The tether turns to chains, but admiration soured to greed. By the summer of 1790, Ruth's fortune had grown enormous. Wainwright's demands grew with it. He wanted more gold, a share of her Clay Street house, a promise to bring him into society, introduce him at her glittering salons. You would not survive an hour in my world, Ruth said coolly. Pouring tea. I survived you, he hissed back. For the first time, Ruth felt something unfamiliar bloom behind her ribs. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of a variable she could not fully control. Seeds of betrayal, Wainwright began following her. Servants whispered that they saw him lingering near her carriage, watching her house from the shadows like a starving dog outside a feast. He started keeping records of her husband's deaths, dates, symptoms, inheritance amounts. Ruth discovered a hidden ledger in his lab, her life rendered as columns of figures and coded notes, a silent noose tightening with every entry. When she confronted him, he smiled and said, Insurance. In case you forget our arrangement. That night, Ruth could not sleep. She lay in her silken bed with her eyes open to the dark and thought, a man who can blackmail me can destroy me, and I do not allow survivors. And so, while Richmond's salons buzzed with gossip about her newest courtship, the wealthy merchant prince, Alexander Fitzhugh, Ruth Holloway began planning something she had never done before. Not the murder of a husband, the murder of an accomplice. A poisoner's funeral. The first thing to die in Dr. Marcus Wainwright's house was the clock. Its ticking had been a ceaseless metronome for his experiments, keeping time for his poisons, his dreams, and his decay. But on the night Ruth Holloway came to visit, it simply stopped. The second hand froze between seconds like the house itself was holding its breath. Wainwright, of course, didn't notice. He was too busy gloating. The blackmail ledger, he had invited her to his cramped study, papers spread like flayed skins across the table. Candlelight made his eyes glitter. Imagine, he purred, what these would fetch if they found their way to the magistrate. Dates, symptoms, causes of death. Each husband like a bead on your little rosary of grief. Ruth smiled faintly. And yet here you are, still alive. Perhaps your instinct for self-preservation is stronger than your greed. Oh no, Wainwright said, leaning close enough that she could smell the decay on his breath. Greed is why I've survived. It was the closest he had ever come to confessing that he knew she was planning to kill him, and it sealed his fate. The invitation. 3 nights later, Ruth sent him a gilded note sealed with black wax, a private supper. To discuss the Fitzhugh inheritance and your future role in our partnership. Wainwright arrived flushed with victory. He wore his best coat, threadbare at the cuffs, and carried a cane with a hollow handle. Inside, a glass needle filled with strychnine. He thought he was coming to seize power. He didn't realize he was walking into an opera where Ruth had already written his final aria. The stage's set, her Clay Street parlor was transformed. Curtains drawn, fire roaring, candles burning low and soft. A table set for 2 with porcelain so delicate it seemed to tremble at their touch. And wine. She poured a dark French burgundy into his glass with a grace that felt almost hypnotic. Wainwright watched the liquid swirl, thinking of blood. "Do you ever feel it?" Ruth asked, voice as smooth as the wine. "That little tremor just before the world changes forever?" He smiled thinly. "Every time I drink with you, they toasted. They drank. Ruth did not." The silence after it took 20 minutes. Wainwright's voice began to slur, his hand missing the rim of his glass. His pupils dilated until his eyes were pools of black. He tried to rise. The cane clattered to the carpet. Ruth stood perfectly still, watching as he sagged back into the chair like wet cloth, his lips working soundlessly around words that no longer came. "Belladonna," she said quietly, almost tenderly. "Old-fashioned, I know, but poetic." He stared at her as the world slipped away. In his last moment, he seemed almost impressed. Then he was gone. And the clock in his house, the one that had stopped when she arrived, began to tick again. The public story, the magistrate's report was mercifully dull. Dr. Marcus Wainwright, found dead at his writing desk. A suicide born of despair and disgrace. No mourners came. No one asked why the ink on his latest research was smeared with wine. Ruth attended the funeral in perfect black, veil drawn, expression of study and solemnity. In her reticule, next to her handkerchief, was Wainwright's blackmail ledger. Every incriminating note and date carefully rewritten in her own hand to cast suspicion anywhere but her and with the last man who knew her. Secrets lying in Richmond's frozen earth. Ruth Holloway finally turned her gaze back to what she had come for all along. Alexander Fitzhugh, merchant prince, husband number 7, and after him, the crown jewel of her list, Governor Edmund Randolph himself. The hunter hunted by the time Ruth Holloway married Alexander Fitzhugh. Richmond had stopped whispering about her and started mythologizing her. She had become an elegant ghost haunting their social circles, a tragedy draped in silk. Every man who touched her died, and yet men still lined up to try. Like moths who'd heard the flame killed all their brothers and wanted to see for themselves. The wedding was curiously subdued. No fireworks, no roaring toasts, just a quiet ceremony on a fog-laced March morning in 1791, with Ruth's veil trailing like mist across the church's stone floor. Fitzhugh, one of Virginia's wealthiest merchants, beamed as though he had married salvation itself. Captain Jonathan Hale stood in the back pew, silent as carved stone, and watched her smile. He was the only man in the room who saw teeth in it. A predator's honeymoon. Fitzhugh's house was a gilded maze of mahogany halls, oil paintings, and crystal that chimed when you whispered near it. Ruth slipped through it like Mercury, cataloging weaknesses. He was vain, careless, drunk on his own fortune. He bragged about the convoys he had supplied during the war, the same convoys she knew he had secretly betrayed for British gold. When he boasted, she smiled. When he touched her, she smiled. When he left his ledgers unlocked, she smiled and copied them by moonlight with fingers steady as a surgeon's. Outside, Captain Hale was circling like a silent hawk. The investigator Hale was not like the others. He didn't underestimate her. He didn't want to marry her. He wanted to map her, like a battlefield. He visited Dr. Harrison under the guise of polite concern and asked offhand why so many of Ruth's husbands had died of stomach ailments. "I can't explain it," the doctor admitted, eyes shadowed. "But if grief were poison, Mrs. Holloway would be dead many times over." Hale smiled politely. Inside, he marked Harrison's name with a black pin. Then he began to follow Ruth's servants. Not the ones in her house, the ones who had worked in the houses of her dead husbands. He bought them cider in quiet taverns. He asked questions no white man ever asked them, and the whispers they gave him, about strange teas, hidden vials, and a widow who never seemed surprised when her men began to die, chilled him to the bone. The net tightens by summer. Fitzhugh was coughing, then complaining of cramps, then sweating through silk sheets while Ruth dabbed his brow and cooed about overindulgence. Dr. Harrison visited twice, his unease sharpening into silent dread. Hale waited outside, watching through the rain-streaked window as Ruth spooned soothing syrup into her husband's slack mouth. When Fitzhugh finally died on a hot July night in 1791, Ruth's sobs echoed through the marble halls like music. The will left her half his empire. The funeral left her crowned in pity, but Hale didn't see a grieving widow. He saw a serpent swelling after another meal. The turning point, Hale returned to his rented rooms and opened the dossier he had been building for months. 8 names. 8 men tied to a secret treason network he had been investigating. 7 of them now dead, all after marrying the same woman. He found no record of a Jonathan Holloway in Continental Army roles. But he did find mention of a British spy executed in 1779. Betrayed, ironically, by the very network Ruth's husbands had belonged to. And there, in an old coded dispatch from a captured British officer, was a single chilling reference. The widow has vowed to burn the covenant root and branch. Hale stared at the words until the candle guttered low. Ruth Holloway wasn't seeking justice. She was executing vengeance, patient, perfect, and unstoppable, unless he stopped her first. And so, as Ruth shed her mourning black for silvery silks and began her carefully staged flirtation with Governor Edmund Randolph, Captain Hale packed 2 pistols, 3 forged warrants, and a coffin nail, because he had decided the only way to end Ruth Holloway's reign of blood was to bury her alive in her own lies. He just didn't know yet that she was already planning to bury him. The widow's last waltz. The invitation was written in ink black as morning lace. Captain Hale found it on the desk of his rented room. No seal, no signature, only his name, the hour, and the address of Ruth Holloway's Clay Street mansion. He read it 3 times before he realized his hand was trembling, not from fear. From certainty, this was the night. The trap was set, and he was walking straight into it. The room of masks. The library glowed like a stage when he arrived. Velvet curtains shut out the moonlight. Firelight pooled across the Persian carpet, and there they were, Ruth in silver-gray silk like moonlight made flesh, and Governor Edmund Randolph, radiating authority as though it were stitched into his waistcoat. "Captain," Ruth said softly, almost tenderly, "how good of you to come." Randolph smiled with the kind of warmth men usually reserve for loaded pistols. "Sit, Captain Hale, tonight we speak plainly." The brandy was already poured. Hale didn't drink, the dance of knives. The conversation began politely, like dancers circling. Randolph praised Hale's dedication to justice and hinted that perhaps Mrs. Holloway had been performing a service to the Commonwealth, ridding it of traitors. Hale's jaw clenched. A service? 7 dead men who all just happened to marry the same widow, and you, Governor, coincidentally the sole surviving member of their secret covenant of prosperity? Ruth smiled faintly. "And yet, Captain, no charges have ever stuck to me. Curious, isn't it? So many graves, and not a speck of soil beneath my nails." The air grew electric, thick enough to taste. Hale's finger drifted toward the pistol hidden in his coat. Randolph's hand lay casually on his cane, which Hale suspected concealed a blade. And Ruth simply poured more brandy, her hands as steady as marble angels. The revelation. Then Randolph leaned forward, and with a voice like velvet lined with razors said, "Jonathan Holloway was not a patriot hero. He was a British spy. It was Hale here who identified him as a risk, who recommended his execution. The captain is not hunting you, Mrs. Holloway. He is trying to erase his guilt." Hale's heart stopped. Ruth did not move, but something behind her eyes ignited. Slowly, deliberately, she set her glass down. "So," she whispered, "there were 9. Randolph smiled like a chess player who has just whispered checkmate. "And tonight, Mrs. Holloway, you may choose. Kill me and you die by Hale's evidence. Kill him and you live as my ally." Hale rose, voice low. "Or kill you both and end this forever." The last waltz, everything happened in a single breath. Ruth flicked her wrist. The brandy from her glass splashed across Hale's face, laced with a burning irritant that blinded him instantly. Hale roared, clawing at his eyes. Randolph lunged for her with his cane blade, but she was already spinning, her silver skirts a blur. She fired the tiny pistol hidden in her sleeve straight into his chest. The shot was muffled by the fire's roar. Randolph collapsed, eyes wide with disbelief, blood blooming through his waistcoat like a black rose. Ruth pivoted, striking Hale across the skull with the heavy crystal decanter. He crumpled wordlessly, the world going dark. The curtain falls at dawn. Servants found the aftermath. Randolph sprawled dead by the hearth. Hale collapsed nearby with a pistol still in hand. The room torn by signs of a desperate struggle. Ruth was discovered bound and gagged in a closet, wrists bruised, tears streaking her pale face. Her tale was heartbreaking. Hale had accused Randolph of treason, produced forged documents, and attacked him when the governor refused to confess. They fought, she sobbed, and someone shoved her into the closet as they killed each other. Dr. Harrison examined the scene. Everything matched her story. The case was quietly closed. Tragedy, nothing more. The vanishing widow. Within weeks, Ruth sold her mansion and disappeared from Richmond society. Some said grief had finally broken her. Others whispered she had taken her fortune to Europe. Only the Virginia Historical Society knows the truth, hidden in a sealed journal written in cipher, discovered after her death decades later. In it, Ruth detailed every death-like movements in a symphony. The poisons, the performances, the forged evidence. And the final note, I was never justice. I was consequence. The last poison, there is one final unmarked grave outside Richmond. No stone, no name. Only a single glass vial buried with the bones. Locals say the soil around it still smells faintly of bitter almonds. They call it the widow's garden, and sometimes on windless nights they swear they hear the soft clink of crystal glasses. And a woman's low laugh fading into the dark. That's the end of Ruth Holloway's tale. 8 husbands, 9 deaths, and a legend carved in whispers.